to the Startup Mahakumbh podcast, the official podcast of Startup Mahakumbh, a first-of-a-kind event bringing together best of minds of India's entrepreneurial ecosystem to decode, facilitate, and help grow the thriving startup scenario in our nation. The event is being organized by ASSOCHAM, NASSCOM, Bootstrap Incubation and Advisory Foundation, TIE, the Indian Venture and Alternate Capital Association, and supported by DPIIT and Startup India to firmly position India as a global innovation hub. It anticipates participation from over 40,000 industry and business visitors, including startup founders, HNIs, incubators, VCs, angel investors, policymakers, and corporates from across India and the world. And today on the podcast, we have the privilege of chatting with a formidable panel, really leading voices from the sector. All our esteemed guests today are part of the organizing committee for Startup Mahakumbh. So without much ado, allow me to introduce each one of you individually. First up, Prashanth Prakash, founding partner at Accel India. Prashanth, the pioneer in the Indian startup scene who began investing in tech startups in 2004, way before they captured global attention. Prashanth, thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Next, founder and chairman of Sorin Investments and mentor figure to many, Sanjay Nayar in the house. Welcome, Sanjay, to the podcast.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Another pioneer in the industry, Sanjeev Bikhchandani, co-founder and executive vice chairman of InfoEdge. Thank you, Sanjeev, for your time.
Thank you for calling me.
And Archana Jahagirdar, founding and managing partner of Rukam Capital. Hello, Archana.
Hello, Shivraj. Thank you for having me.
Okay, let's just dive right in. From an investor's perspective, what excites all of you most about Startup Mahakumbh and its potential impact on the Indian startup ecosystem?
I would say, to put it simply, diversity with index. You will have all the sectors represented, all of India represented, many of the better startups coming, many young founders, many students. So diversity with index.
What's exciting for me is that the resilience and, like Sanjeev said, the breadth of the ecosystem is one thing, right? But it will be the first time where a lot of sectors which otherwise are not considered as startup sectors will be made visible. It could be climate tech, it could be manufacturing, and areas like deep tech where you have not had a lot of industry and startup events which have showcased them. So if I'm an investor and I've been thinking about diversifying my investing from, let's say, just investing in e-commerce startups to now looking at manufacturing startups, this is a great platform. I can just come to this one show event and get a quick scan of the landscape, meet a lot of entrepreneurs and see if this is interesting for me. So this is a little bit of a discovery both ways for entrepreneurs to discover investors who would fit them, and for investors to discover sectors which they, or the whole Bharat, the breadth thing, that the inclusivity thing of looking at startups from across India and beyond what otherwise investors have seen.
So for me, I think what is exciting is, uniting everybody together, everyone coming together, whether it's all the VCs, whether it's all the ecosystem enablers, government, policy. I think it's never happened before, right? So this is a seminal moment, history in the making, and who doesn't like to be part of history?
I think from my perspective, a lot has been covered, but just two words I think summarize it. One is helping entrepreneurs and founders connect the dots. I think connecting the dots is something that is very important, but doesn't happen naturally in a big country, different tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 cities. And second is the network effect. So these two things I think are what I think even for investors or for the entrepreneurs is going to be a big takeaway.
So connecting the dots and the network effect. Prashanth, as founding partner at Accel India, you witnessed tremendous growth in the Indian startup landscape over the few years. Where are we right now? And given the sector's current trajectory, what do you foresee as the future?
That's a loaded, full question, right? So you need 30 minutes, not just joking. But, I think we have been through what I would call as a startup decade. There have been multiple companies that have demonstrated that they can build big, they can IPO, like many of what Sanjeev companies have IPO'd. And post IPO, some of them are starting to demonstrate that they are resilient, multi-decadal engines which deliver growth and provide value for investors. And I think India has a unique opportunity to not only build startups, but help the rest of the country, which is, we are a country that is moving away from gold, moving away from, real estate. So I think the next generation wants asset classes that they want to participate in when they want. So, and I think there's nothing like the public markets to do that. But for our startups, we have had a decade of, learning, building. Now we have seen enough role models. I think the next decade is about these startups now learning from both the good and the bad of what happened in the first decade, and using that knowledge now to, and the good news is that a lot of them are learning very fast. If you see the number of startups that have turned profitable in the last 2 years, it's more than, what we've seen in the previous 8 years, right? So I think, we will see an ecosystem that creates more companies that have the capability to deliver profits, that have the capability to list and deliver value. So I think that is what we can expect for the next decade. And the last thing I'll say is, for the next decade, we can expect startups to excel in sectors that were not seen hitherto as startup sectors.
And Sanjay, returning to the idea of the network effect, it is a big tent what we're going to be doing at the Startup Mahakumbh. What can attendees expect, and do you believe it will pave the way for startups to really navigate the challenges, as Prashanth talked about, that we see in the sector today?
Yeah, I think so. And I think, if you looked at this Startup Mahakumbh as one massive platform, you could probably get lost in it, okay? So it's not just about sitting in the plenary and listening to speeches. What they've done is we're breaking this up into 10 verticals or 10 pavilions, B2B, SaaS, climate, fintech, whatever. And I think that is where the network effect really comes in. Because if you just had many plenaries, then I think that's one way to look at it. You don't take much away, but you just sit in the audience and listen. But here you have a chance to interact. There are booths, there are specialized plenary sessions, there are hackathons, there's a lot going on. There is, I think mentioning in the morning, reverse pitches where investors are pitching, where founders are pitching to investors. So I think the real network effect comes at the pavilion level, and not just by sitting in the main stage. So I think it's been pretty comprehensively thought out. So I think at the end of the day, it's for each one to take away from it.
Exactly.
Okay, so we can do as much as we can. It's for people to then nurture the network, reach out, continue to talk to each other when the Mahakumbh is over. And if you make it an annual event, then it can really catalyze India into being the largest startup hub in the world. Who knows?
So it's interesting coming together, but much of the perception is that the investment in the Indian startup ecosystem across stages come from overseas funds. Are there any conscious efforts to expand the local pools of capital then for startups?
I think in terms of local pools of capital, India is maturing for sure. It really comes from local savings, and obviously people who can afford to put money into this risky asset class, okay? And I think local big HNI families, big family offices, propelled by government's effort to create this fund of funds, and SIDBI, which has done a fantastic job to catalyze the sector. And if they put in 1 rupee and you can crowd in 10 more, I think your purpose is solved. So I think that flywheel is just starting. We're seeing more of it, but at a macro level, local capital and local savings are more high duration, more high quality, more understanding of the local businesses. China's done a fantastic job, and I think there's no way that India can be stopped on the same. So yeah, you don't need any special incentives for it. It's just the maturing of the system, the distribution mechanism, few successes that people will see and say, oh, I shouldn't have put money into, a company like this. So it'll catch on. But yes, we do need local capital, let's be clear. But we cannot obviously bridge the whole gap today. So you will have foreign capital for some more time, and it should continue, of course. And by the way, foreign capital follows local capital. In the long run, if locals don't invest, I don't see why foreigners will want to invest. So, it's going to be kind of a tango together.
And Archana, from your perspective, what are the upcoming sectors that hold the best opportunities for young entrepreneurs?
Wow. I think you should have asked that question on my left because there's a lot more history that they all have as investors than I do. But I think, I think it's an open field, really. When you look at younger startups, how to invest in them. And I think the most important thing, more than even sectoral sort of study, I would say that as an investor, you've got to stay away from FOMO. So don't try and invest in a category or sector that everybody is rushing into. That never ends well. I think you have to do your own study and sometimes be tangential. I think some of the best returns in investing, early stage investing, comes when you do something tangential. Like what Prashanth mentioned in Startup Mahakumbh, which is why we are focusing on things like manufacturing, which would not have been a traditional sort of, sector to look at within the startup ambit, right? So I think it's important to dig deep, try and address problems that India has, and then what are the solutions thereof. I think for every investor, it is important to do your own study. So we are all chasing generative AI, of course, but I think the story is much wider, deeper than generative AI.
Okay, this is a question for everyone. So, just sticking with the idea of innovation, the tagline for Startup Mahakumbh is Bharat Innovates. How do you see this event really embodying the Indian spirit of innovation and entrepreneurship, and will it help India become a global leader in this case?
Yeah, so I think just taking off from where Archana spoke about the startup ecosystem now making a dent in areas that were not hitherto areas that startups would. I think we are seeing that on two dimensions. We are seeing that in terms of sectors, and we are seeing that in terms of not it being an urban phenomena, but like a whole Bharat phenomena. So if you combine those two dimensions, then startups are all pervasive, right? So they're no longer, they're these creatures who are influencing every small aspect of our economy and are the real central growth engines of our economy. So just to kind of put that in a global perspective, where did India start? India started as a services export. I mean, where was value created in India first? The pharma and the IT services exports, right? Those were also startups in their own way. Then you had the next generation of startups, which were largely consumer startups, in every area that you can think of, which delivered value to consumers. Then the third generation of startups is B2B startups within the country. And the fourth generation of startups are enterprise startups in AI, which not only deliver value for India, but from India, right? And these are going to be in areas where it's not just about software and taking advantage of technology, but because of this China plus one or China plus N phenomena that we have to really, India has this great opportunity to take advantage of. We have to look at sectors which are actually manufacturing physical products and manufacturing green products, sustainable products from the global south to the global north. So I think these are very, very exciting areas that you'll get some peek to in the Startup Mahakumbh.
Okay, and now just looking at the flip side, the questions a lot of people are asking, issues of governance and compliance have hit some of the biggest startups. They've been in the news. How is it impacting the overall startup ecosystem or the sentiment?
I think what matters is how the ecosystem or regulators and how companies respond, rather than the fact that governance lapses have occurred or perhaps have occurred. We don't know for sure. I cannot comment on specific companies because I'm not inside those companies, so I don't have the data. But I just want to say that now we meet about 1,000 startups a quarter. We invest in 3 or 4 every quarter. We've thus far invested totally in about 100 startups. Yeah. We have not encountered any integrity issues in perhaps more than one very few startups. Right. So my assessment is that maybe 98%, 99% of Indian startups are clean, they're honest, they're compliant, they're well-joined. But yes, bad news will make headlines, especially when bad news happens in large companies. Some of the bad news is speculative. We don't know what's inside there actually. So I would withhold judgment and I would say that, listen, Take a company like Zomato. Current market cap is hitting $16 or $17 billion. That far exceeds the capital they ever raised in their lifetime. And it possibly exceeds all the capital raised by maybe the next dozen startups. So the value creation of the ones that do well and are well governed will far exceed any bad news that comes, the capital that those startups consume over a 10 or 20 year period. So you just got to wait for the long run, I think. And see, good news takes time to come, and good news does not make news. It's bad news that makes news.
And
Just want
a couple of...
Sorry, just adding to that. So my take is a little bit maybe adding to what he said. I think there have been issues, that's pretty clear. But if you go back and think, what is happening is if founders lose their way, or they start doing things that are not meant to be done, or they do it very aggressively, or they start some other hobbies, it's primarily because I also think that they have taken too much capital. They've probably gotten incredibly high valuations, and then you get onto this treadmill that you've got to do better and better, and you've got to grow into the valuation. So I think one of the changes that will happen as you look at all of this is the positive side is that founders too have to think about what capital they need really, how much do they need, when do they need, okay, and what kind of investor do they want on their cap table. That becomes important. What value do you bring to me, and why should you be a part of my family? And similarly for the funders, they can't wake up in the morning and say, I got surprised. I mean, what the hell were you doing sleeping at the wheel, right? So I think it works both ways. So I think Sanjeev made all the right points. But the other flip side of it is that it's both our responsibilities as investors and the entrepreneurs who have a role to play on both sides.
I think it's also maturing of the ecosystem, right? As the ecosystem evolves, matures, there will be a couple of cautionary tales, and I don't think that should dishearten the entire ecosystem. I think it is important how founders, investors are also reacting to it. I don't think anybody is saying, oh, well done, or this is how it should be. I think everybody is very responsive. I think, in fact, it's good for younger entrepreneurs to already see what they shouldn't do. And I think as we mature further and evolve further, we'll probably see very few of these, if at all this is a...
And we believe, pan-industry get-togethers like this can be leveraged as platforms to reinforce the kind of things Sanjeev was talking about, where everybody knows that, the majority of the startups govern themselves well. Of course, they need support, they need help, and hopefully we will have a few masterclasses, we will have a few ways in which they can take away some good practices on how to, as they scale, look at this as a good foundational capability.
And just sticking with the idea of masterclasses, you're all investors and mentors as well. You may have anticipated news of a global slowdown. What kind of approaches or strategies would you advocate or follow to maneuver these?
I think it's, being very prudent on the capital that you have at a given point in time, right? So you have to align your strategy to that available capital. And in that available capital, what usually it means is that how much of effort are you going to put to discover or iterate to make sure that you have product fit, right? And if and when you have product fit, typically there is enough capital, because I think there are a different class of investors who now know that all you need is money to scale and not to experiment and iterate, right? So I think it's that phase of when you have just maybe a few customers but don't have enough replicable customers and enough of a replicable go-to-market model or a scale model, that is kind of the time when they need a lot of hand-holding and support and mentoring, like you said. And some of these masterclasses hopefully will help them in that chasm and help them get over.
One of the things I've learned is that when you're making an investment and the founder is pitching, some of them are listening to you and some are just listening for the sake of it. And you've got to have the ability to make out who's really listening and understanding what you're saying. That's number one. Second trait, at least we think that really works, want entrepreneurs to ask for help when they need it, and not when it's too late and then cry wolf. But you've got to be able to ask for help. I think asking for help is a really good thing. Okay. And on the funders part, I think even the old fuddy-duddy style of having some cadence of reporting, even in a startup, you don't want to kill it bureaucratically, but hey guys, I give you $5 million. Let's have some cadence of reporting, some regular meetings, some MIS, even if there's no revenues, okay, what footfalls, something. And that's not burdening them, okay? So I think this understanding is going to be very critical. And whether we call it a masterclass or we call it teachings from our lessons of the past or whatever you want to call it. But hey, even $4 million is as big as $400 million, right? And, you've got to ask for some basic cadence and you're supposed to get it. But the biggest problem I find is that founders ask for help too late. And I suppose that takes time. But, the other trend we are seeing, I don't know if you guys are seeing, is that a lot more experienced people are putting up startups nowadays. And ex-multinationals, ex-bankers, ex-venture capitalists are now starting real businesses because they've seen what business models can really work in Bharat. And boy, those guys are coming in with their own 10, 20 crores. They're bootstrapping themselves longer. They end up having larger equity stake at the end of a 5-year cycle rather than a 5% stake at the end of a 5-year cycle. So the game is changing, and I think those are going to be great success stories.
And given that the game is changing, how do you view this government's initiatives towards creating a robust startup ecosystem?
I think there's a Startup India program, and that's what steamed under it. But I think the single most important thing this government did was put up a fund of funds for startups managed by CP. And I happened to serve on the first committee of that fund. And what that fund did was it kick-started the domestic venture capital industry. There was some happening, but this one really put it in the next level. And I think and I tell you our own experience. So we raised capital. The only round we ever raised for IPO was in April 2000. Market went down. For the next 4 to 5 years, there was no venture capital available in India, next to no venture capital, because all the foreign funds went away, right? There were very few domestic funds. So for 4 to 5 years, there was a complete risk capital drought, right? And that set back the system by famine, the whole ecosystem. Domestic venture capital does not have the choice to go away, right? It is domestic. And it is more stable. It is more permanent. We, as InfoEdge, began to invest in 2007. We have no option of withdrawing from India and investing only in the US or Europe. We don't invest overseas, we only invest in India. So domestic venture capital is really important. There isn't, in percentage terms, as much of it as we need. And therefore, overseas capital is really important. We need it, we welcome it. But we also need domestic venture capital. And the government put up this fund of startup, which they now replenished further. And now I think a third or fourth committee is operating. And that's, I think, a big thing about it.
And what about policies? What policies do you think are necessary to really sustain this healthy startup ecosystem?
See, I'll just add a couple things to what Sanjeev was saying in terms of policies, which have really helped. I think the focus on early incubation, starting with the Atal Innovation Mission and what they have done with BIRAC, and especially in sunrise sectors and areas such as deep tech, the whole opening up of the space sector. So we are going to become one of the 2 or 3 global hotspots for space. I mean, that's no mean feat, right? So I think they have been very progressive in looking at what next for India and making sure that seed capital and accelerators and incubators in those areas are well funded. And which is, I think, that catalytic role is the most important role for the government. Now, there are few areas where, I think these have been long-term asks of the industry where we believe that things can be smoothened out a lot more. Things have been done to, for example, for the ESOP, in the ESOP regime, the whole taxation whether it needs to be at what period of time and certain conditions that need to be fulfilled for companies that can take advantage of that. There are sometimes not practically applicable for a lot of these startups, right? So I think ESOP is a great tool for democratizing wealth building, and I think these are areas that need a little bit of attention. The second area I think that has been a long-term ask is to equalize the taxation regime between public equities and private equities, right? So I'm taking more risks as a venture investor. So in some sense, the capital gains have to be as favorable, if not more favorable, to what happens in public equity. So these are, I think, areas that are complex. They're not easy because they also span across multiple departments within the government. And IVCA is very closely working with them, and IVCA has made a lot of progress in some of these areas and got a lot of support from the government. So hopefully these are things that need to be further worked upon.
And returning to the event that's about to take place, what sort of business tie-ups and collaborations can be expected out of it?
I think, if you look at how, events of this nature typically happen, it's a little bit of, personal initiative. And what is the setting that allows those sort of tie-ups and, business to happen? So I think we've talked about that there are going to be diverse pitches. Now, there's a reason for that, right? I think a lot of founders talk about how investors are opaque, so they don't fully understand. So we hope that, if term sheets are not issued on the spot, I mean, we're not Shark Tank, but, there'll be a lot more sort of, interaction between investors and founders, which I think is a primary goal of any event like this. But I think to also engage with government, you've got GAEM coming in. I think, Mr. Singh also spoke about it, that how do startups engage with the government, whether it's as on procurement side, whether it's on the policy side. I think each sector has its own sort of requirements. So we do see a lot of very meaningful conversations and dialogues.
And lastly, do you think the Startup Mahakumbh 2024 could set the trend for more startup-centric summits, much like investor summits that we've seen across state governments? And will it give the Indian startup ecosystem the impetus it needs to take the lead, maybe even globally?
We're already number 3. We are going to be number 1 with this.
No, I can tell you that there were many smaller events, and we felt there's room for one large showcase of the entire startup ecosystem. And Sanjeev.
So look, there are already lots of startup events happening, conferences happening, and they're very good. And we are supportive, and we even go to them and we individually and we speak, perhaps even sponsor. So there's DICON, there is Bombay Tech Week,
there's the Bangalore Tech Summit.
Sorry, there are many events. But we felt there was need for one apex, large, big tech event, and that's what it is.
So you have the GITEX in Dubai. So you have
Web Summit, you've got Viva Tech.
So I think as a country that has now close to 100,000 startups, I think it's time we had, the mother of all kind of startup events.
Okay, thank you so much, Prashanth, Sanjeev, Sanjay and Archana. Thank you for sharing your valuable perspectives and supporting Startup Mahakumbh. To our audience out there, we hope this conversation with our leaders has been instrumental in spurring passion for innovation and entrepreneurship. Remember, Bharat Innovates is not just a tagline, it's a bid to every Indian listening to this podcast that innovation starts with you. The Startup Mahakumbh, set to be held from the 18th to the 20th of March at Bharat Mandapam, New Delhi, is going to be the biggest, the grandest conference of global investors, innovators, scholars, and policymakers focused on a startup scenario in the nation. So go visit the website and follow our social media pages. Links are in the description of this podcast. Learn more about the event, explore opportunities, and join the movement. And do subscribe to the Startup Mahakumbh podcast. There's more to come.